The flames danced against the night sky, consuming everything Sarah had built over the past 5 years. Her wedding photos, the vintage jewelry-making tools inherited from her grandmother, the half-finished pieces she'd promised to clients, all of it transformed into ash and smoke before her eyes. The heat pressed against her face like an unwelcome caress, but she couldn't look away. Beside her, Marcus's reflection flickered in the windows of their burning home, his lips curved into a smile that made her stomach turn. "Now you have no choice," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of satisfaction that had become more frequent over the years. "You'll have to come stay with Mother and me. It's for the best, really. You've been so stressed lately with that little business of yours." Sarah's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting back the scream building in her throat. The distant wail of fire engines grew louder, but she knew they were already too late to save anything meaningful. 5 years ago, she would never have believed Marcus capable of this. Back then, he'd been the charming investment banker who'd swept her off her feet, showing up at the small gallery where she sold her handmade jewelry with fresh coffee and pastries every morning. He'd called her work fascinating and unique, asking endless questions about her creative process. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, it had felt like a fairy tale. The changes were subtle at first. A suggestion that she should use their joint account instead of maintaining her separate business account. "It'll be easier for tax purposes." Darling concerned comments about her working late at craft fairs. "I worry about you driving home alone at night." Small criticisms about her spending on materials. "Do you really need another set of tools? The ones you have work just fine." But Sarah's jewelry business had been growing steadily. Her distinctive pieces, each one handcrafted with recycled metals and ethically sourced stones, had caught the attention of several high-end boutiques. She'd been featured in a local lifestyle magazine, and the subsequent surge in orders had her working longer hours to keep up with demand. That's when Marcus's behavior shifted from subtle manipulation to overt control. He'd started checking her phone regularly, claiming he was just looking out for her safety. When she mentioned hiring an assistant to help with the administrative work, he'd exploded, accusing her of wasteful spending and poor business sense. The joint account she'd agreed to use became a weapon, every purchase scrutinized, every deposit questioned. He'd convinced her to let him manage the finances, claiming his expertise in investment banking made him better suited to handle their money. Last month, she'd discovered the truth. While searching for a missing invoice in Marcus's home office, she'd found statements from a separate account she'd known nothing about. The numbers made her head spin. Thousands of dollars transferred from their joint account, her business earnings systematically siphoned away over the years. When she'd confronted him, his response chilled her. "I'm protecting you from yourself, Sarah. Women in business, they get all these grand ideas. Sometimes they need a firm hand to guide them." Now, watching the flames consume her studio, Sarah understood with crystal clarity what she'd been trying to deny for years. This wasn't love. This wasn't protection. This was possession, pure and simple, and Marcus had decided that if he couldn't control her business, he'd destroy it completely. The fire engines rounded the corner, their red lights painting the street in surreal flashes. Marcus placed his hand on her shoulder, fingers digging in just a little too tight, a gesture that to observers might look like comfort, but Sarah recognized as a warning. "Come on, dear," he said, his voice honey-sweet with poison underneath. "Mother's expecting us. She's already prepared your old room from when you were sick last year. Remember how well she took care of you then?" Sarah remembered. 3 days of food poisoning that had kept her in bed while Marcus cancelled her meetings with potential retail partners. She couldn't prove anything, but she'd never been sick like that before or since. As Marcus guided her toward his car, Sarah caught a glimpse of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, watching from her window with knowing eyes. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and in that connection, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Because what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that not everything she valued had been in that house. Some things, like the determination growing in her heart, were fireproof. The Victorian mansion loomed before them, its shadow stretching across the manicured lawn like grasping fingers in the early morning light. Sarah clutched her small suitcase, all she'd been allowed to salvage from the fire, and followed Marcus up the granite steps. The door opened before they reached it, revealing Eleanor Blackwood in her signature pearl necklace and perfectly pressed dress, despite the early hour. "My poor dears," Eleanor crooned, though her eyes held no warmth. To think someone would do such a terrible thing to your lovely home. The police simply must find the arsonist. She shot a knowing look at Marcus, who smiled tightly. Sarah's stomach churned at their silent exchange. The guest room, her prison, really was exactly as she remembered it from her mysterious illness last year. Pale yellow wallpaper with tiny roses that seemed to writhe in the dim light, heavy curtains that never quite opened fully, and a four-poster bed that dominated the space. The adjoining bathroom had no lock, a fact Eleanor mentioned casually as she showed Sarah where fresh towels were kept. "We removed it during the renovation," she explained, patting Sarah's cheek. "Safer that way, dear. Wouldn't want you to slip and fall with no one able to reach you." Days blurred together in a suffocating routine. Eleanor supervised every meal, commenting on each bite Sarah took or didn't take. "You're looking rather peaked, dear. Best finish your soup, Marcus, darling. Doesn't Sarah seem a bit thin to you?" Marcus would agree, watching with those calculating eyes as Sarah forced herself to eat whatever was placed before her. But in the quiet moments, when Marcus was at work and Eleanor was occupied with her garden club, Sarah began to fight back in small ways. She'd smuggled her phone charger in her suitcase, hiding it between the mattress and box spring. Each day she documented everything in password-protected notes, times, dates, conversations, every small control and manipulation. "Your dress is inappropriate for dinner," Sarah Eleanor had said last Tuesday at 6:43 p.m. "Change into something more modest. We wouldn't want to give Marcus the wrong impression about his wife." "You seem agitated today," Marcus had noted on Thursday at 7:15 a.m. "Perhaps Mother should add some chamomile to your evening tea. It helped so much last time you were difficult." The library became her sanctuary. Eleanor approved of reading so much better than that crude jewelry work, and Marcus encouraged her to improve herself through literature. Neither suspected that between the pages of Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre, Sarah was meeting with Lisa, a domestic violence counselor who recognized the signs immediately. "What you're experiencing is financial abuse," Lisa explained during their third meeting, voice low among the stacks. "Destroying your business, controlling your money, isolating you from income sources, these are all forms of domestic violence." She slipped Sarah a small notebook designed to look like a prayer journal. "Document everything. Keep it at the library if you have to. We'll build your case." Sarah had nearly dropped her teacup when Lisa helped her access her credit report. There it was in black and white: accounts she'd never known about, loans taken out in her name, credit cards she'd never seen. The systematic financial abuse stretched back almost to the beginning of their marriage. "He's been planning this for years," Sarah whispered, hands shaking as she stared at the numbers. "All those times he insisted on handling the paperwork, the taxes, the business licenses." "It's not your fault," Lisa assured her, passing her a tissue. "Abusers like Marcus and his mother are experts at making everything seem normal, reasonable, but we can help you. There are organizations that specialize in helping women rebuild their financial independence." That evening, Sarah sat through another suffocating dinner, picking at Eleanor's roast while mother and son discussed her as if she weren't there. "She spent 3 hours at the library today," Eleanor reported, cutting her meat into precise squares. "I do worry about her becoming too absorbed in fiction. It can give women such unfortunate ideas." "Perhaps we should limit her reading material," Marcus mused, reaching for Sarah's hand across the table. His grip was gentle but immovable. "We only want what's best for you, darling. You understand that, don't you?" Sarah forced herself to smile, to squeeze his hand back. "Of course," she murmured, while beneath the table, her other hand pressed against the prayer journal hidden in her pocket. Inside, along with her careful documentation, was a list of local women's shelters and the beginning of an escape plan. Later that night, she lay awake listening to the old house creak and settle. Through the wall, she could hear Eleanor and Marcus talking in low voices in his study. Their words were muffled, but their tones carried clearly Eleanor's sharp concern, Marcus's soothing reassurance. They were planning something. Sarah could feel it in her bones. Rolling over, she pulled out her phone, shielding its glow with her body as she typed a message to Lisa. "Something's wrong. They're acting different. Need to meet tomorrow." The response came quickly: "Library, 10 a.m., reference section. Bring your documentation. Stay safe." Sarah deleted the messages, tucked the phone away, and closed her eyes. In her mind, she could still see her house burning, but now the image brought a different emotion. The flames hadn't just destroyed her past, they'd lit a fire inside her, one that grew stronger with each documented abuse, each secret meeting, each small act of rebellion. Marcus might have burned down her house, but he'd failed to understand something crucial. Home wasn't just a building. Home was independence. Home was safety. Home was self-respect. And Sarah was going to fight to build herself a new one, brick by brick, if she had to. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Sarah allowed herself to feel a glimmer of pride. She was no longer just surviving, she was gathering ammunition, building a case, preparing for war. The thought brought a small smile to her lips as she drifted off to sleep, Eleanor's roses writhing on the walls around her like silent witnesses to her quiet revolution. The garden that separated the Blackwood mansion from Mrs. Chen's modest craftsman house became Sarah's lifeline. Eleanor, ever conscious of appearances, couldn't object when Sarah offered to tend the flowers that bordered their property. It's the least I can do, since you're both being so generous. What neither Eleanor nor Marcus realized was that every morning, while Sarah pulled weeds and dead-headed roses, Mrs. Chen would be tending her own garden just a few feet away. "The peonies need more sun," Mrs. Chen commented one morning, her weathered hands gently turning a bloom toward the light. Like people, flowers will bend themselves into painful shapes searching for warmth, when sometimes what they really need is to be transplanted. Her dark eyes met Sarah's, conveying volumes in that simple glance. Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened, conducted in careful whispers between the hydrangeas and lavender. Mrs. Chen shared tea in delicate cups passed carefully through a gap in the fence, and with it, her own story. "I was 22 when I married him," Mrs. Chen revealed one morning, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "He was successful, respected in the community. Everyone said I was lucky. The abuse started slowly, a push here, a harsh word there. Then control of my money, my friends, my family. It took me 3 years to escape." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the teacup. "How did you do it?" "One small step at a time," Mrs. Chen replied. "A hidden dollar here, a secret friend there. Most importantly, I learned to be patient, to plan carefully. My mother used to say, 'The bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists.'" She reached through the fence, pressing something into Sarah's palm. "I've watched you since the fire. You're stronger than you know." It was a key, small, brass, unremarkable. "My back door is always open to you," Mrs. Chen whispered. "And my house has many good hiding places." But Sarah began tucking away small amounts whenever she could. The cash Eleanor gave her for household supplies, carefully budgeted down to the penny, yielded a few dollars here and there. When Marcus, in a show of trust, allowed her to run errands, she would buy items on sale and save the difference. Each precious bill found its way into a hollow book in Mrs. Chen's study, alongside a burner phone Lisa had provided. But Marcus's watchful eye never wavered. He noticed everything: the slight dampness of Sarah's shoes from the morning dew, the faint scent of jasmine tea that clung to her clothes. "You've been spending an awful lot of time with the old woman next door," he commented one evening, his tone deceptively casual as he loosened his tie. "Mother tells me you chat with her almost every day." Sarah kept her face neutral, her voice light. "Mrs. Chen gives me gardening advice. The roses have never looked better." Marcus stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, but Sarah fought not to flinch. "I just worry about you getting too attached. People come and go, after all. Elderly neighbors especially, anything could happen." The threat in his words was clear as crystal. That night, Sarah lay awake for hours, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see the warm glow of Mrs. Chen's kitchen light, steady and reassuring in the darkness. The next day, Eleanor announced new rules over breakfast. "The garden service will be taking over the flower bed," she declared, stirring her coffee with precise movements. "You shouldn't be straining yourself, dear. And really, all that time outdoors isn't good for your complexion." Sarah felt the walls closing in tighter. Her weekly library visits were suddenly chaperoned by Eleanor, who hovered nearby as she browsed the shelves, making it impossible to meet with Lisa. Her phone disappeared from her suitcase. "Oh, it must have been accidentally packed with the donations for the church sale," Eleanor said with false sympathy. But they couldn't watch her every second. In stolen moments, Sarah would slip into Mrs. Chen's house through the back door, adding to her emergency fund and checking the burner phone for messages from Lisa. The hollow book now held nearly $2,000, not enough to start over, but enough for a bus ticket and a few nights in a motel if things got worse. Remember, Mrs. Chen told her during one of their increasingly rare garden conversations, sometimes the most dangerous moment is just before escape. Like a snake, an abuser is most likely to strike when they sense their control slipping. As if proving her words, Marcus began coming home for lunch unannounced, his surprise visits timed perfectly to interrupt any potential conversation over the garden fence. He installed a security camera that covered the back garden, claiming it was for everyone's safety. Sarah noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past Mrs. Chen's house, their tinted windows concealing the drivers. The tension in the house grew thick enough to choke on. Eleanor's comments became sharper, laden with veiled warnings about grateful wives and family loyalty. Marcus's displays of affection took on a desperate edge, tight hugs that lasted too long, kisses that felt more like claims of ownership than expressions of love. One evening, as Sarah prepared for bed, she heard Marcus and Eleanor arguing in hushed voices downstairs. Words floated up through the heating vent, getting out of hand. Need to take more decisive action, can't risk everything we've built. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her heart racing as she watched the security camera's red light blink steadily in the darkness outside her window. She thought of the money hidden in Mrs. Chen's house, of Lisa's growing file of evidence, of the careful plans they'd made. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd known deep down since the night of the fire: this would end either with her escape or something much worse. There would be no middle ground. The library card fell from Marcus's pocket as he removed his jacket, fluttering to the floor like a death sentence. Sarah's heart stopped as she watched him pick it up, his expression shifting from confusion to cold rage as he examined the checkout record printed on the back. "Interesting reading choices," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Financial abuse and recovery legal rights in domestic violence cases. Tell me, Sarah, when exactly did you start meeting with Lisa Martinez from Victim Services?" The room seemed to tilt. Sarah's mind raced. How had he discovered Lisa's name? Then she remembered the security cameras. He must have followed her, watched her meetings through the library windows. "Marcus," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't protect what's mine?" He advanced slowly, the library card crumpling in his fist. "I saw you with her today, plotting, scheming, and all those conversations with that meddling old woman next door." Sarah backed away, her legs hitting Eleanor's antique settee. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen's kitchen light glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. "Mrs. Chen has nothing to do with this," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Marcus's smile was terrible to behold. "Oh, but she does. Mother told me she saw you sneaking into that house when you thought no one was watching. What have you been hiding there, Sarah? What lies have you been spreading?" The staircase creaked, and Eleanor appeared, her face a mask of concerned disapproval. "I tried to warn you, Marcus. She's been corrupted by those ridiculous independence movements. All that time at the library, filling her head with dangerous ideas." "You're right, Mother. But don't worry, I'll handle this." Marcus moved with frightening suddenness, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Let's pay our neighbor a visit, shall we? Time to show you what happens to people who interfere with my marriage." Sarah's survival instinct kicked in. She twisted away, thanking heaven for the self-defense videos she'd secretly watched on her burner phone. "Don't touch me." Or what? Marcus sneered, reaching for her again. "You'll call the police? With what phone? Tell them what? That your loving husband and mother-in-law have given you everything, protected you from your own poor decisions. They'll learn about the accounts." Sarah shot back, her voice growing stronger. "The fraud. The loans you took out in my name. Lisa has copies of everything." Marcus's face contorted. "You stupid woman. No one will believe you. I'm a respected investment banker. You're just a failed jewelry maker who can't even keep track of her own finances." He strode to the window, glaring at Mrs. Chen's house. "Once we deal with your little spy network, you'll see I'm right. You need my guidance, my protection." The threat in his voice made Sarah's blood run cold. "If you touch Mrs. Chen..." "You're what he whirled back to her. "You have nothing, Sarah. No money, no business, no proof. Just the wild accusations of a confused woman and a senile old neighbor." But Sarah wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen standing in her garden, phone pressed to her ear, eyes locked on the scene unfolding in the Blackwood house. The old woman's face was set with grim determination. Marcus followed her gaze and swore. He lunged for the front door, but Sarah was faster. She grabbed Eleanor's prized Tiffany lamp and swung it at the security system panel on the wall. Sparks flew as the connection died. "You'll regret that," Marcus snarled, changing direction and advancing on Sarah. "Mother, call the police. Tell them my unstable wife is having another episode." But Eleanor stood frozen on the stairs, staring past them through the window. Red and blue lights were already reflecting off the garden flowers, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Police. Open the door. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Officers swarmed the house, responding to Mrs. Chen's report of domestic violence in progress. Sarah's burner phone, retrieved from its hiding place, contained recordings of Marcus's threats. The hollow book in Mrs. Chen's study held not just Sarah's emergency cash, but detailed records of Marcus's financial abuse, backed up by Lisa's documentation. "Mr. Blackwood," one officer said, "reading from a warrant, we have some questions about multiple fraudulent accounts opened in your wife's name." Marcus's mask of control finally crackled. "She's my wife. I was protecting our assets. She can't." "She can," and she did. Mrs. Chen's voice cut through his protests as she entered the house, Lisa Martinez at her side. The domestic violence counselor carried a thick folder of evidence, and her face showed grim satisfaction. "Financial abuse is still abuse," Mr. Blackwood, Lisa stated firmly. "The DA's office is particularly interested in the pattern of fraudulent loans and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the house fire." Sarah watched as Marcus's carefully constructed world of control crumbled around him. Eleanor had sunk onto the settee, her perfectly maintained facade cracking as officers began questioning her about her role in the abuse. For the first time since the night of the fire, Sarah stood straight and spoke without fear. "I want to press charges," she said clearly. All of them. The women's shelter was nothing like the Blackwood mansion, and Sarah was grateful for that. Her small shared room held a twin bed, a drawer for her few belongings, and something she hadn't had in years: peace. No analyzing every word before speaking, no walking on eggshells, no questioning her own sanity. "It's normal to feel overwhelmed," her roommate Maria told her one night, sharing tea much like Mrs. Chen had done. "I spent my first week here just sleeping. It takes time to realize you're really free." The preliminary hearing came faster than expected. Sarah sat in the courtroom, Mrs. Chen on one side, Lisa on the other, as Marcus and Eleanor were led in wearing matching expressions of injured dignity. Their lawyer painted a picture of a concerned husband trying to protect his unstable wife, but the evidence told a different story. Bank records, loan documents, insurance policies. The methodical dismantling of Sarah's financial independence laid bare in endless paper trails. The prosecutor's voice rang clear: this was not protection. This was a calculated campaign of isolation and control. When the forensics report on the house fire was presented, showing clear evidence of arson, Marcus's facade finally cracked. His shout of "she was mine to protect" echoed through the courtroom, making his lawyer wince and the judge's gaze sharpen. Word spread through the local artisan community. Sarah's former clients and fellow craftspeople rallied around her. A GoFundMe campaign organized by her old gallery owner raised enough for new tools. More importantly, it raised awareness about financial abuse. "Your story needs to be heard," the local news reporter told her after covering the trial. "You're helping others recognize the warning signs." In her shelter room, Sarah began creating again. Simple pieces at first: wire-wrapped pendants, basic chains. Her hands remembered their skill, even if they sometimes shook. Other shelter residents would gather to watch her work, and soon she was teaching basic jewelry making classes as therapy. "You make beauty from broken things," one woman said, watching Sarah transform a twisted piece of copper wire into a delicate leaf pendant. "Like us." The conviction came down like a thunderbolt: 15 years for Marcus, 3 for Eleanor. The charges ranged from financial fraud to arson, from domestic abuse to criminal conspiracy. The restitution order covered not just the destroyed house and business, but years of stolen earnings. Mrs. Chen helped her find the apartment, a small studio above a bookstore, walking distance from the gallery that had agreed to showcase her new collection. The morning Sarah moved in, a package waited by the door. Inside was a delicate ceramic tea set and a note in Mrs. Chen's elegant handwriting for new beginnings, in your own time, on your own terms. That first night alone, Sarah stood at her window, watching the street below. No security cameras tracked her movements. No one monitored her phone. No one controlled her finances. The fear wasn't completely gone. Healing would take time, but for the first time in years, she could breathe freely. On her workbench lay her first major piece since the fire, a phoenix pendant, its wings crafted from melted-down segments of her old wedding ring. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but neither was survival. Each hammer blow that shaped the metal had felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Sarah made her first cup of tea in Mrs. Chen's gift set, settled into her second-hand armchair, and watched the sunset paint her walls in shades of gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: rebuilding credit, managing the restitution funds, growing her business back to its former success. But tonight was for savoring the simple freedom of being alone with her thoughts, answering to no one but herself. She touched the phoenix pendant, feeling its warmth. Metal always carried the heat of the hands that shaped it. Like her, it had been transformed by fire, emerging stronger, more beautiful, and finally, irrevocably free. 1 year later, Sarah stood in front of Phoenix Rising jewelry, cutting the ribbon at her grand opening. Mrs. Chen beamed from the front row, while Lisa proudly displayed a pendant from Sarah's Survivor collection, each piece designed to remind its wearer of their inner strength. The store wasn't just a jewelry shop. The back room hosted weekly support groups for domestic abuse survivors, where Sarah shared her story alongside resources for escape and recovery. Her case had become a landmark example of financial abuse prosecution, studied by law enforcement and victims advocates alike. The signs are often subtle, Sarah told her groups, a loving gesture that feels like a chain, a protective act that's really control. But there's always hope, always a way out. Her phoenix pendant caught the light as she spoke, its wings spreading across her collarbone like a shield. The shop's walls displayed not just jewelry, but information: domestic violence hotline numbers discreetly placed in the women's restroom, pamphlets about financial abuse disguised as care instructions for fine jewelry, trained staff who knew how to connect customers with help. And every morning, Sarah and Mrs. Chen still shared tea, now in the small garden behind the shop. Two survivors, different generations, united in their mission to help others break free.